Hey Monster Hunters, if you're enjoying Beast and Bible, please rate and review the show on Apple Podcasts or wherever you listen, and don't forget to share it with somebody who might like it. Now, on to the show. Welcome back to Beast and Bible. The wait is finally over and we can return to the second half of my interview with Dr. Jeffrey Cohen from Arizona State University. In this episode, we will look at a few more religious and biblical intersections within his work, particularly monster theory. If you haven't listened to part 1 of Interview with the Scholar, I encourage you to go back and get caught up. Now, let's get to the interview. There's a book by Natasha Mickles and Joseph Laycock that looks at religion. I think it's Religion, Monsters, and Culture, and they suggest 5 more theses to add to your 7, and one of them talks about how the monster is phenomenologically real, whether we're looking at angels and demons, whether we're looking at whatever was on the ark, whatever it is. They're coming from a perspective, I think, I don't want to speak for them, but I think for maybe someone who is either not a part of a faith tradition or is critical of faith traditions, not entering it with what you just said, sort of a smugness or a disbelief, but recognizing, however I feel about it, this is experientially real to this community, to these people. I need to handle that with care. I mean, what are your thoughts on that?
Well, I think that's exactly true. It's just, we have to be careful about what we mean by experientially real. So that can mean that it's real as an invitation to thought. It can be real as an invitation to fear. It can be real as a limit. It can be acknowledging that a monster has real effects. I think that look around that it does, no matter what. Acknowledging that it has a place of agency within a belief system. We should absolutely do that. But then that doesn't tell you exactly what it means, acts, does, accomplishes within that belief system. So I think it is a really good start.
There was a story, it's a little bit older now, and maybe you've heard it. I know when J.K. Rowling was trying to bring her Wizarding World to America and tried to incorporate indigenous people, Native Americans, and suggested basically that this idea of skinwalkers and magic was... first of all, taking a Native American belief system and making it a part of this fictional wizarding world. And then I believe there was implications of how it was the European wizards who brought the magic to the indigenous peoples. Really understandably got a lot of backlash from communities who say, this is still an active part of our belief system, our worldview, and you've basically taken it as, raw material for your fantasy novel. That's one example, I think, maybe where,
That's how cultural appropriation works, right?
Yeah.
You just hoover it up and you make it into something that reaffirms something for the powerful, and then all of its challenge is gone. And on the other side of it, you possibly associate the magical and the monstrous with the childish and the undeveloped, and you leave it over to a place where it's not serious.
Yeah,
it's really serious in many of these folk traditions. It's not to be scoffed at. It is to be understood with sympathy, engagement, and curiosity.
Yeah. So in your experiences, you've probably dialogued with many students from many different backgrounds and faculty and colleagues. How are you able to navigate having really diverse conversations, maybe over really challenging, emotionally loaded issues that can still end up being positive dialogue?
I think one thing that really helps is to focus first on something that is not easily assimilable into most dominant traditions. That is a kind of monster that's a one-off in a film or a feature or a short story. Use that to develop a kind of working practice of here's how we can talk about monsters. Get a little disengagement on kind of the monster as a thing to think with and is a generous invitation to possibility, and then move back from there. It's easier than saying starting with a deeply Christian figuration of a monster in which people have strong ideas of what's right and wrong there, and don't necessarily want to be challenged to look at one remove. But when students get to the point where they can see that things that even mean a lot to them as personal belief or as part of their own faith identity are part of a conversation that includes others who have similar faith identities, beliefs, and things that are sacred to them, then a space of generosity instead of, kind of trying to one up or have one single truth can open up a little bit better.
Yeah, no, it's good. I like that. One of my students asked this question, wanted me to pass this on. What is the worst application of monster theory you've ever seen?
So you pass that on to me, and I've spent the whole day thinking about it. And I don't know that I've ever seen an application of monster theory where I've just said, oh my God, that's so wrong. I'm going to write an angry email this minute and tell them to cease and desist. There are some that I find more interesting than others, but I don't really know that someone could get it wrong, or if that's happened, I haven't seen it. Luckily, most people take the monster as an invitation to generous and capacious thinking. So, yeah, not yet. I've never really had that angry reaction or the shake my head and thought, how did you get that wrong?
That's good. I know, and I'm not saying this is what created the question for the student, but I think sometimes, maybe they were in the middle of their paper, for the class or their presentation, like this has got to be the worst, ever. But it sounds like, no matter what you've seen, it's been interesting and valuable and contributed.
Seth, I'm glad you said that, because I think that is what living inside a writer or a thinker's head is like. So even as I wrote the essay, I was just like, I'm not sure if this is the best thing I ever wrote or just the worst thing I ever wrote, and I should stop and delete it from my hard drive, because I'm just stuck. I haven't done something like this before. I haven't written around 7 theses. Like, what the heck am I even up to on this? I'm like, either it works or it's just terrible and whatever. I'm in it. I'm going to keep on going.
Yeah, no, I've had a very similar experience with books and writing projects where there's that halfway part. It's like an existential crisis in the middle of it. And you're like, what am I doing? Is this even a thing? I shouldn't be doing this at all. And then it turns out and it works. Not all the time, but
not all the time. But Seth, don't you feel like it's better to be someone who has the, is this good? Could I make it better, than someone who is convinced that I'm so right on this and I can hardly wait to show the world how right I am.
Yeah.
Anticipates the applause in advance. What an obnoxious kind of person that would be.
Yeah. I totally agree. Moving to a really, I don't want this to be such a hot button discussion, but maybe it will be. What contemporary monsters do you see that are particularly reflective of two things, American culture and religious culture? One of my friends on Twitter was sharing there's a new book coming out by Stephen Wolfe called The Case for Christian Nationalism. So arguing for it, which many in my tradition and others, other Christian traditions are sort of recoiling, like what on earth? How are you arguing for this? And so from my world, looking at some of these discussions of Christian nationalism and religion and politics, what contemporary monsters, or if there's a book, a film, a video game, is there a good metaphor that you feel reflects what's going on?
I think there are multiple ones. So if you were to talk about, monsters related to Christian nationalism, white Christian nationalism at its worst, aren't we seeing it right now with Kanye West and demonization of the Jews, and the ways in which that has, obviously there's been some condemnation, but there's also been a fair amount of celebration that he spoke the truth.
Yeah.
And that this international cabal of blood-sucking pedophiles has been exposed. And believe me, I am in no way saying that is the base of all Christian nationalism,
Right.
but it's part of certain extremist versions of it. And the Jew will always be a figure that haunts and comes back and preoccupies the imagination, despite the fact that, in the large scheme of things, there aren't that many Jewish people in the world. But boy, do they have a hold on many people's imaginations, really outsized. And it's a fear and desire thing. It oscillates between the two. But having said that, I think we continue to live in an age that is extremely inventive when it comes to monsters. So One of the most recent monster movies I really enjoyed was the movie Nope, which is about a UFO that is really an entity that's kind of giant camera in the sky that sucks people into it and digests them and does all kinds of interesting work thinking about the place of black actors in Hollywood, the ways in which they've been used, the prices that actors of color play. It's very sophisticated and really scary too.
Yeah.
It's like the superb horror movie that's both a commentary on culture and does all kinds of thoughtful work.
Yeah. Dovetailing off that a little bit, later in this season of the podcast, we have Brandon Graffius on, who talks about theology and horror and reading the Bible with horror. And we look at Judges 19 with Rahel Wells from Andrews University, which is the story of, the Levite's concubine, and, he chops her up and sends her through the mail. And it's in the Bible, and it's horrifying. And he has some really interesting reflections on the value of horror. And speaking from a fairly conservative, Christian denominational standpoint, the subject of horror and scary things is very taboo in many ways. But is there a value in horror? Is there something that it challenges us with? And this is not a blanket endorsement of every horror film, just speaking from a Christian perspective. Looking through the Bible, there are some horrific stories in there, and yet we're told, every scripture is God breathed and it's useful, and we're sort of landed with these texts, and sacred texts that we have to deal with. But beyond those, in pop culture, we have these horror texts that show up. What is the value, contribution? Is it valuable? Is there a contribution? How do you kind of process horror?
I think horror can be different from the monstrous. I think you're right to think about it in the Bible, which is one of its most important locations for thinking about repercussions of things that sometimes should be done, sometimes shouldn't be done. Mm-hmm. I told you I just finished a project on Noah, and one of the things that really fascinates me is that the biblical story of Noah is pretty bare bones. You don't get a lot,
right?
But we all know a lot more than what's in the Bible because we've looked at pictures for so long. From the very first illustrated Bible that we have, the Vienna Genesis, in its very first illustration, it's a pyramid-shaped ark floating away as though stranded on rocks and about to die have to watch it leave. Wow. That scene is not in the Bible. There's nothing outside the ark. And yet, my colleague Julian Yates and I, as we wrote this book, noticed that the number one artist-made scene of the ark tends to be it sailing away and the people left behind and their experience of what it's like to be, the horror of being left outside. The reason, and sometimes, the people underwater or some horror scene like that, again, non-biblical. But the reason why it seems right to me to think with that is one of the divergences over Noah is that in Jewish tradition, Noah's kind of problematic. In Christian tradition, he is the figure of obedience to God. God says, build me an ark, and he builds it. There's no conversation. In Midrash, starting with Rashi, Rashi says, some say Noah was great in his own generation, but wouldn't be great in any other generation, such as Abraham's. And the idea being that when Abraham is told about destruction of Sodom and Gomorrah, he argues with God. Would you destroy the righteous with the wicked? And God thinks about that, and there's a back and a forth, and God says, no, it gets down to, I will save people that are right. The same with Moses on Sinai. He convinces God not to destroy the Israelites after the golden calf. And honestly, the same with Cain, who argues for a special mark so he can't be murdered. And God says, you're right. So there is something in Jewish tradition, there is something in the God of the Hebrew Bible who likes to be argued with and can come to a relationship with humans through that argument. Noah had the ability to argue and did not. And for that reason, a lot of people drowned that maybe didn't have to drown. That's the complexity of the Noah situation. I think in Christian tradition, and I'm a medievalist, so I really know medieval more than anything else, it was hard to sit with a Noah who didn't argue for some of the people to maybe have joined the ark, and that's why they get depicted on the outside or under the water. That is, the human imagination invited people to sit with those who had been doomed to drown and to experience their horror as a way of being left out or left behind. And that, that can have all kinds of movements toward hopes for redemption or making better choices, or you name it. But the sitting with the horror, I think, can have a powerful hold on the human imagination.
Yeah, absolutely. Thank you. So I don't know how much you can say, but does this Noah project, do you have a title yet, a release date?
Yes. So the book's called Noah's Archive, and it will be out from University of Minnesota Press in April of next year.
Awesome. Very cool. Congratulations. Sounds like
Thanks.
a great thing to look up. I'm going to kind of end with this, and we'll see where we go from here, but what is your personal favorite monster of all time and why? Or maybe a top 2, top 3 favorite monsters and why?
Yeah, again, I feel like that's the choose your favorite child. All right, if I have to go with childhood, it probably would be, since we brought up Sesame Street, not Cookie Monster, but Grover.
Okay.
There's something about Grover's inability to become the monster he was destined to be that I just found it so cute and so charming.
Saw a monster in the mirror when I woke up today. A monster in my mirror, but I did not run away. I did not shed a tear or hide beneath my bed, though the monster looked at me and this is what he said. He said, wabba, 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 woo, woo, woo.
For a kid who didn't always fit in and was kind of bumbling through life, trying to find a place where possibilities got realized, Grover really spoke to me as monster. In fact, one of my favorite early books that I remember was called The Monster at the End of This Book, which was about Grover trying to get to the end of a book he's reading, the book that you hold in your hands, to find the monster. And at the end, there's a mirror, and Grover says, "Oh, it's me."
So funny.
And I just love that realization. So that always stayed with me and helped me to think the monster in really big terms. The other monster that I'm a huge fan of, who's a little more obscure, is in the Norse sagas. There's a saga called Grettir's Saga, and it has this undead monster named Glam. And Glam comes back from the dead and haunts a house and rides its rooftop like a horse and torments the people. But he's so larger than life and so scary. I just couldn't believe that somebody had written that text. I think it's 14th century, if I remember. I'm just like, this is better than Stephen King. And it opened up my eyes to how imaginative people have always been.
Yeah. Cool. Thank you very much. I think if there was any other question. I had one, and then it slipped away.
Just like the monster.
Monster always escapes. That's right. No, you mentioned Grover, and one of my favorite scenes with Grover is when he is serving at the restaurant. It's this recurring sketch where he gets distracted, does a dance, and like dumps the food, everywhere. And for some reason, that was the funniest thing, ever. So
it is so funny, and it's always that same Muppet that he's serving. It's just like standard issue guy.
Yep.
So,
Yep.
He just wants his food. He doesn't want the show. He doesn't want the stacked plates.
Just wants a bowl of soup. That's it. Thinking of your comment on 14th century Norse mythology and kind of being, stunned by or taken aback by the creativity. I had a little bit of that, nowhere near as old, but I remember the first time, I don't know if it was in a lit class or something, but I read Bram Stoker's Dracula and was genuinely found it terrifying. And I'm thinking, like, this has been done so much. I had seen the 1930s Dracula, and it's not that scary, whatever. It's dramatic. And then reading the novel, it was an audiobook, and I was like, this is terrifying.
Yeah, it lost none of its power over the ages. And I think if people only know Dracula from the movies and vampire mythology, Bram Stoker's Dracula is unbelievable. And the same with Mary Shelley's Frankenstein. It's one of the most complicated monster stories ever written, and it holds up to repeated readings. I just love it.
Yeah, they keep cranking them out, and variations on it. And we look through, I've mentioned this in a different episode, but both Dracula and Frankenstein, it's interesting to watch them change, throughout different cultures, histories, they get reinvented. Looking at the new BBC Dracula and some of the commentary on why a crucifix is terrifying. And of course, growing up You see it's a sacred symbol. There's work looking at how Dracula is sort of the Eastern other, maybe represents the Jews who have been monstrified by the West and Christianity. And then you get to the BBC version, and there's this dialogue with Dracula and why are crucifixes scary, and it's because the church has terrified people so long that when he drinks their blood, he absorbs the terror that the religious institution has caused. So it's this complete shift, and same monster, but very different feel to it. Where have you seen very well-known monsters take on different iterations and they almost become a cultural commentary that has changed? Have you anything come to your mind?
Yeah, well, I think you already identified it well with the vampire. It bears all the cultural weight of the moment that it was imagined. It's hard to think of a monster that is timeless because each one arrives in the clothing of its moment and has a statement to make about whoever's telling the story now.
Very cool. Well, thank you so much for being on the podcast. This has been great. I've enjoyed our conversation. I'm looking forward to the new book, and we'll continue to use monster theory in class and use it to analyze both the monsters we find in sacred texts as well as popular culture texts. And just thank you.
I appreciate it, Seth. And tell your students, contact me anytime. I love it.
Absolutely. I was going to ask you, what is the best way for people to connect with you online? What social media?
Email, Twitter. The only social media that I'm really on is Twitter, unless you want to see the last meal I ate on Instagram, which I don't really think is that interesting.
Sure. Okay. Sounds good. Well, I'll definitely tell my students about it. Of course, our listeners, know about it. Again, thank you for the work you're doing and for stopping by with good dialogue, good chat.
Sounds good. Thanks for welcoming me.
Thank you for listening to Beast and Bible. I hope you enjoyed the interview with Dr. Cohen. Join us next time when we welcome another professor from Arizona State University, someone who has a very popular and public program about monsters. She and I will discuss the most important of scary subjects, Jesuits and werewolves. Hosted, written, and produced by Dr. Seth Pierce. Edited by Heather Moore. Logo design and social media by Chelsea Ernina. Tech and equipment support by Steve Husett and James Gigante. Project support by Heather Moore.